People with Asperger syndrome are outnumbered by a wide margin by those who are considered typical. And because we are outnumbered, some people see that as a flaw or a defect. We are not flawed, we are not defective, there is nothing wrong with us simply because we have different personality traits. Let me put that in perspective with a very simple analogy. We know the motorcycles are outnumbered by automobiles by a wide margin. Now, does that mean that motorcycles are defective or that they are flawed simply because they are different and outnumbered? Is there something wrong with them because their traits are different? I would say probably not. It depends on how you look at it. You know, if you're expecting a motorcycle to be like an automobile, then obviously, relative to the automobile, we could say it's flawed. It's only got two wheels. Most of them, you can only seat two people on them, realistically. So there are very stringent limits to motorcycles, but you can turn that backwards. Relative to a motorcycle, we could say cars are flawed because, well, they don't go as fast. They're not nearly as fun to drive, at least for some people. Some people love to get on a motorcycle, fly down the highway, wind blowing through their hair, except in states where you're required to wear a helmet. That doesn't appeal to me at all. I could just as soon sit in front of a fan in the summertime. I don't need the high speed, but that's not the point. The point is that people with Asperger syndrome are not defective because we are different and because we are outnumbered. Let's take this analogy just one more step further and keep in mind that the highways and byways, the roads that we drive on, are made for cars and for other large vehicles. They're not made for motorcycles. If they were, then the rest of us could not ride on them because they would be too small. The highways and byways of life are made for typical people, but that doesn't stop people with Asperger syndrome from using those highways and byways. Now, sometimes it makes it challenging, makes it very inconvenient, but still we can do it. Now, the reason we say that is because one of the challenges, one of the differences that people with Asperger's syndrome have compared to typical people is that we seem to be challenged in the area of socializing. Now, again, that doesn't make people with Asperger's syndrome broken. It doesn't make us defective. It just makes us different. And sometimes there's actually a benefit or an advantage to be socially challenged. Off the top of my head, without even digging into it, I can think of a lot of ways that people with Asperger syndrome have an advantage because of their social differences relative to people who are typical. Think of this. Think of a buffalo with Asperger syndrome. Okay, you got to use your imagination, but if you're an Aspie, that should be no problem, which is one of the advantages of being an Asperger's person. Aspergian is the word. That is, you tend to have a good imagination. So imagine a buffalo with Asperger syndrome. Not a part of the herd at all. The other buffaloes do not understand him or her. So the buffalo with Asperger syndrome stands by the side. Now, there is a stampede of buffaloes. But because the Aspie buffalo isn't part of the herd, he or she doesn't participate in the stampede, but just stands back and watches as a herd of buffalo stampede over the cliff. The point being that socializing often causes the crowd to march in the wrong direction. But if you're not part of the crowd, you can actually see everybody's going the wrong way. I'm glad I'm not a part of that. So there are some strengths. Let's dig a little bit deeper into this. When we study Asperger syndrome, there's two excellent sources. One of them is the DSM-4. The other, of course, is the DSM-5. I think both of them are good sources, even though most people would move toward the DSM-5 simply because it's been updated, but let's don't discredit the DSM-4 just because it's different. Here's what we learned from the DSM-4. It defines the Asperger's, look at this word, disorder. A qualitative impairment in social interaction is manifested by two of the following. Okay, let's take a look at these. There's actually 4 of them, but at least 2 of the following qualify you to be potentially one who is an Aspergian. Well, the first one is marked impairment in the use of multiple nonverbal behaviors such as eye-to-eye gaze, facial expression, body postures, and gestures to regulate social interaction. When I was a kid, our class was divided into 2 groups. The first group was me, and the other group was everyone else. And I recall, for example, during, most schools call it recess. In our school, we called it gym. I don't know why, but it was gym class. And the other kids would play together and interact naturally. I had no idea how they did that. I just did not. So I stood over by the side, and watched them. Fortunately, the herd did not stampede off the cliff, but to me it was just confusing. It was awkward for me not to be able to be a part of the crowd. And if you have Asperger Syndrome, you know what I'm talking about. If you know somebody with Asperger Syndrome, maybe this will help you understand what they are experiencing. By the way, I have no problem with therapists. I actually encourage people who need therapy to see an educated, qualified therapist. I'm not a therapist. So why do you need me? Well, for this reason, because therapists who do not have Asperger Syndrome are looking at it from the outside. And that, by the way, is a good thing because it gives them an objective perspective. As somebody who's been diagnosed with Asperger Syndrome, I look at the syndrome as the traits from the inside out. Rather than outside in, I'm looking inside out. So I get a totally different perspective. But those 2 perspectives, the one I call the life's laboratory or experience perspective, that's my perspective, complements that of the therapist. So it's not that one is better than the other, but I think you need both to get a good view, to get a good analysis of what we're dealing with. I'm nearly 70 years old, so for 7 decades I have lived with Asperger Syndrome. I've learned a thing or 2, and I'm still learning. I've been there, done that, and I'm still there, and I'm still doing it. So I'm just sharing with you some of my experiences, what I understand about the syndrome, and hopefully I can help you. My participation was limited to peer invitations. So the second thing about Asperger Syndrome, as understood by DSM-4, is a failure to develop peer relationships appropriate to developmental level. In other words, as I understand what they're saying is, it's really hard to make friends. Very hard to make friends. Now, when I was a kid, I had almost 0 friends, but I did have one really good friend who lived in the neighborhood. And in hindsight, I wish I would have been a better friend to him, but I just didn't know how. But I tried. But I did have a few friends. Very difficult to fit in, very difficult to be a part of the crowd. And again, that's not a flaw. That's not a defect. That's not a disorder. That sometimes is very, very useful. So when you get to that state in life, that stage in life, peer pressure, where the crowd is doing it, therefore you're pressured by the crowd to do it as well. I had that peer pressure, but somehow because I was outside the crowd, it wasn't nearly as intense. Yes, I wanted to be accepted, and I'm sure you do too. And I still do. Nearly 70 years old, I still like people to accept me, but I'm just built differently. Nature has designed me to be a different person. You with Asperger's have the same thing. Back to our analogy. Motorcycles are designed differently from automobiles. They're made different in the factory on purpose, by design. That doesn't make them flawed, it makes them different. They are made for a particular purpose. I can give you lots of examples, but one comes to mind in particular, and that is I have a coffee cup in which I pour my coffee every morning. 1 cup a day. I'm disciplined. I limit myself at the exact same time with the exact same ingredients every morning. That's a pattern, another part of being an Aspie, but we'll get into that in another video. And I also have a mixing bowl. Well, both of these vessels have an express purpose. The coffee cup, the coffee mug is, actually it's a mug, is designed for drinking coffee. Now, if I wanted to, I could take a mixing bowl or a salad bowl and I could drink coffee out of it, or I could take my coffee mug and I could mix salad in it. It wouldn't be very convenient, but it could be done. But let's admit it. The coffee mug and the mixing bowl are 2 different vessels designed for 2 different purposes. But neither one of them is innately flawed because of it. They're just different. So we have to understand the being different, because we tend to find it challenging to make friends. That doesn't make us flawed, that just makes us different. And again, sometimes that is a benefit. So I very seldom had close friends. I would live in kind of a bubble existence, and that would sometimes go away with my close friend. When I was at home around family members, I was comfortable. I could let down my guard. I could come out of my shell. But it didn't stop after elementary school and high school. It was still there. When I was an adult, it was still there. That is one of the reasons why people with Asperger Syndrome, Aspersions, find it difficult to hold employment, because they can't connect to other people very well. Now, that doesn't mean they're not good employees. Doesn't mean that they're not loyal employees. Doesn't mean that they're not hardworking. Doesn't mean that they're not punctual, that they can't do their job well. But sometimes when you can't interact with people, they think you're just a little bit weird. Well, I think the word creepy is the word that I hear most often. Sometimes they say space alien, but you just don't interact, and because of that, some people just don't like you. They think you're arrogant. They think you are conceited, or they just think you're creepy. So they stay away from you, and ultimately you find yourself again in that bubble, and quite often people with Asperger Syndrome find it virtually impossible to hold down a job. As I look over my past, I held down a job once for 6 months. I think that's the longest. But fortunately, I was able to hire myself, started my own business. Nobody there to fire me unless I fired myself, which I guess I did when I retired. But yeah, you can make it. You can still travel down the same highways and byways as the automobiles, but sometimes you just can't do it the same way. I've never seen a motorcycle with a steering wheel. Somebody probably has made one. I've just never seen it. We are different, not a flaw, but we are different. And there's nothing wrong with it. Let's accept it. Because when you accept your difference, then you can use it to your advantage and to the advantage of others. You can use it more wisely. According to DSM-4, characteristic of those with Asperger Syndrome or Asperger Syndrome, or Asperger's Syndrome if you're in Australia, a lack of spontaneous seeking to share enjoyment, interest, or achievements with other people by lacking or showing a lack of showing, bringing, or pointing out objects of interest to other people. Oh, look, it's a cow. I don't think I've ever said that in my life. Now, the illustration that I like to use of this, and I've used it in other videos, is basketball game. The score is, well, the other team has a 2-point advantage and you're down to the last second of the ball game, you're going to lose. Good news, your team's got the ball. They have possession. In that last second, the team member on your team, as you're sitting in the stands watching with everyone else, your team member shoots what they call a Hail Mary. Well, they call that in football, but same thing. From the opposite end of the court of the goal, and as the clock ticks to 0, it goes through the hoop. Scored. The place explodes. I mean, all the fans in the stands, those on your team anyhow, jump up and down and they cheer. They are so excited. They make loud noises. They scream. And you sit there quietly and you get it. Yeah, this is a big deal. We just scored by 1 point in the final second of the game. But do I have to jump up and down and make an idiot out of myself? No, but it's perfectly normal for them. They're not flawed because they're excited and they are emoting their enthusiasm physically, nor are you flawed because you sit there and watch them. All right, some people think you're a little strange because of that, but so be it. Number 4 is a lack of social or emotional reciprocity. That means somebody says, "How are you?" And you look confused. And you feel pressured. There's a lot of stress here, a lot of anxiety. This person, let's call them a hologram, is talking to you and you're not sure why. Okay, there's a reason. I refer to typical people as holograms because sometimes people with Asperger Syndrome view life as if they are watching a television screen, a television monitor. You're watching a live feed. Somewhere there is a television camera. And it's a live feed, but it's recording people. Maybe it's a shopping mall, maybe it's Walmart, maybe it's a school, maybe it's a church, wherever it happens to be. A bunch of people. And you can see them on the TV screen. You're not a part of them. You're not one of them. You're aware of their existence. You see them. You can reach out and touch the TV screen if you want to. You're just not a part of it. That's kind of what it's like to have Asperger Syndrome. And when somebody comes up and talks to you, how you doing? My response when I was a kid was to look down and say, fine. That was it. I didn't know you're supposed to have some form of reciprocity where you carry on a conversation. The first conversation I can remember having in my life was when I was a teenager. And, I talked with my close friends and family, but I'm saying outside of that, was an insurance agent who came to our house, and he was typical of a salesman. He just had that personality. And I recall carrying on a conversation with this guy, and I enjoyed it because for the first time in my life, it seemed there was somebody who took me seriously. He didn't see me as creepy. He didn't see me as a space alien. Just wanted to have a conversation. And I thought that was enjoyable, even though I don't think I said a whole lot. So that reciprocity, somehow, it just doesn't come natural. You can learn to do it, and I have learned to do it, but it's a bit challenging. Hologram. That's how you see people. All right, let's step into the future. Modern technology has advanced. No longer are we watching live feed television on a screen, but rather now we can actually be technologically transported. It's an illusion, but still. It's as if we are there with those people, right in the middle of them. Now, we're not really, but instead of watching them on the screen, you're in the middle of them watching them. Incredible technology. But they're just holograms. So you're sitting back watching, enjoying the show, And it's perfectly okay to stare at these people because they're holograms. They're not real. You're not in a real world. You're in a make-believe world. It's like watching television. You just happen to be in it. That is what it's like to have Asperger Syndrome. That's what it's like to be Aspergian. You're just watching it on television. You just happen to be in the screen, not watching from in front of the screen. A lack of social or emotional reciprocity. DSM-5 is essentially the same, but it has variables. So let's take a look at this. The diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, no longer referred to as Asperger Syndrome, even though everybody still calls it that. We know what we're talking about. But they still see it as a disorder. I just don't feel disordered. In fact, I feel like I'm put together properly. If I were different, then I would be disordered. If you take apart the motorcycle and try to put it back together like an automobile, that will be a disorder. If you take the automobile apart and try to reassemble it to be a motorcycle, oh, that will be a mess. And again, somebody's probably tried to do it, and who knows, maybe they did it successfully. Personally, I have no interest whatsoever in being disassembled because people think I am disordered and try to put me back together to be a typical person. I don't want to be typical because for me, that actually would be a disorder. Leave me alone. Let me be the way I am. Let me be a motorcycle. And I can figure out how to go down the highways and byways of life just fine. And if you want to help me, I'm okay with that too. Don't call me flawed. Don't call me disordered. Don't call me disabled. I can handle it. And so can you. For 70 years, I've handled it. And you can handle it just as well. But it goes on. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts is manifested by the following currently or by history. So these traits, can we call them attributes? Are you okay with that? These traits, these attributes, can be seen in your past. They can be seen in your present. Now, the good news is in the present, as you get older and you mature, you learn to ride your motorcycle better. And so you can interact with the traffic. No problem. You realize, you don't have to go 90 miles an hour everywhere you go. You can just merge right in with the traffic. Now, they all know you're not an automobile and you know they're not motorcycles. Now, occasionally you'll see another motorcycle and you can wave, but you go with the flow and everybody's okay with that. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interest, emotions, or affect to a failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. Probably one of the biggest, okay, let's use their term deficit, one of the biggest deficits that I ever had was the ability to initiate a conversation. When I approach people and they approach me, I become anxious. I'm in a state of anxiety. I've learned to hide it. It's a good thing you do. It's kind of like if you're a mouse and you're approached by a cat, you want to make sure that mouse, or that cat rather, doesn't know you're a mouse. But I've learned to handle it, and I've learned to be polite. Now, if you're not polite, say hello. I don't want to say hello. I want to look down. I want to look away. I don't want to see you. But if you do that, I have learned in my 70-some years, or nearly 70 years, that people think that you are arrogant. They think that you are conceited. They take offense. They don't like you because they think you don't like them. And sometimes they will actually try to hurt you. They don't understand that you don't drive a motorcycle Well, you don't drive a motorcycle, you ride it. But you don't operate a motorcycle the same way you operate an automobile. They don't get it. They think you should be able to maneuver exactly the same way, but you cannot, because you are designed by nature to be different for a purpose. Why is that our flaw? Seems to me that would be the flaw of typical people. They're the ones who are disordered because they don't understand us. They're missing that component of reality. Don't blame yourself. Now, again, it's a good thing to try to understand where they're coming from so you can adapt accordingly. Out there in traffic with other people, you have to understand where they're coming from so you can maneuver through life's highways and byways and roadways as smoothly as possible without having a wreck, without having an accident. And so you learn, as uncomfortable as it is, as challenging as it is, as difficult as it is, to be courteous and polite. And you also learn, as you're with all these holograms, using back to that analogy, okay, they're actually real people, so you got to be kind of nice to them, and please don't stare at them because they don't like that. And you learn to say, hello, eye contact. Oh, that's so difficult. But you know what I learned to do? In fact, I actually learned this when I was in college, early 20s, is when I would make my way through the highways and byways of life, and I would encounter all of these holograms walking past me as I was going somewhere. I taught myself to intentionally make eye contact, or try to, just for the fun of it. Very unnatural. But what I found is most people aren't making eye contact with me. But when they did, you know what I did? I spoke to them, said hi. Hard to do, but I did it. And after a while, I started getting good at it. I say hi to just about everybody nowadays. I don't know what to say after hi, but I say hello. And I keep on going. Very challenging to engage in conversation. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interactions. We're back to DSM-5. Ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding the use of gestures to total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communications. And again, as I said earlier, this is evident in the past, and it's evident in the future. When I was consulting with a therapist, one of the things that she noted in her notes was that I had what she called flat effect. That's just natural. That's the roar of the motorcycle. I didn't do that on purpose. I just had a flat effect. Now, when I make videos, I have learned that if I just sit here really still and quiet, it gets kind of boring. In fact, I might be boring when I'm not being still and quiet. But I can wave my hands around. I can make facial expressions. Now, when I go back and watch my videos, okay, I can see then the flat effect. Now, what's interesting is I was a pastor for 12 years, and I don't consider that a job. But I was a pastor for 12 years. And something that I learned is actually I was kind of good at public speaking. I don't know why. I could talk to a crowd, and I could wave my hands around, and I could raise and lower my voice. I could do all the things that normal people do in conversation. But when the sermon was over and I had to meet and greet the congregants, the members of the congregation, that was tough. Same people. I just talked to them. I was watching some guy who was giving advice on how to make YouTube videos. And he said, here's what you do. You pretend the camera is a person. And you talk to the camera just like you talk to people. Not me. I do just the opposite. When I'm out and about, I talk to the holograms as if they're cameras. I don't talk to the camera as if it's a person, because if I did, I'd freeze up and I would be stressful and I'd be stressed out and anxious. So I'm talking to a camera, and I feel very comfortable doing that. And I've heard other people with Asperger Syndrome say much the same thing. They are very comfortable in front of large crowds. just backwards, very comfortable in front of large crowds. But after their speaking engagement comes to an end, and they're expected to converse one-on-one with those who just listen to their wonderful speech, all of a sudden they become a different person. That's not a flaw. That's a characteristic. It's a trait, and it's perfectly okay. How do you know? Because you take those same people, those typical people who are so comfortable interacting one-on-one and in groups. Take any one of them, put that person on the stage in front of a crowd, and you know what? Most of them, with a few exceptions, will freeze up. Suddenly they become Aspersions. They become Aspies. So I think of it in this term. There are two kinds of, everybody is an Aspie. Everybody is an Aspergian. There are some of us who are one-on-one Aspies, and then those typical people, they become Aspies when they get in front of a large crowd. So let's go back and take a look. Well, let's take a look. One more point. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. What that means is, if I understand it correctly, difficult to make friends, and if you do make friends, it's difficult to maintain relationships because you just don't get it. You don't understand what's going on here. Now, what I said on the website is this: the inability to sustain interpersonal relationships seems to stem from personal anxiety and confusion. Throughout my nearly 70 years, it was not just anxiety, but it was nearly always coupled with confusion. It's also confusing. I don't get it. They are augmented by a missing sense of value. Socializing isn't fun. It's unpleasant. So I said, what's the point? I just want to go home and be alone. And when I do that, the anxiety is gone for the most part. The stress subsides. And I realize, being a motorcycle is not all that bad of a thing. And I am grateful that nature made me to be who I am, the way I am. And I hope that you, as a person with Asperger's Syndrome, are grateful that nature made you a motorcycle and not an automobile. That you are made a coffee cup and not a mixing bowl. That you are the buffalo who stands by the side while the herd stampedes over the cliff.